The sound of breaking glass echoed through the Harlem streets that cold October night in 1938. But it wasn't the glass that made grown men step back into the shadows. It was the silence that followed. The kind of silence that comes right before a storm tears everything apart. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood in front of what used to be Murphy's real estate office, his coat collar turned up against the wind, watching smoke curl from the broken windows. The fire department wouldn't be coming. Not tonight. Not for this. Told you he'd handle it, whispered an old woman from her stoop across the street. Told you that boy don't play when it comes to family. To understand what happened that night, you need to go back 3 weeks earlier, back to when Margaret Johnson, Bumpy's mother, received an eviction notice that would change everything. Back to when a racist landlord named Thomas Murphy made the biggest mistake of his life. Margaret Johnson had lived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue for 12 years. 12 years of paying rent on time, every month without fail. She worked double shifts at the laundry house, her fingers cracked and bleeding from the lye soap, just to keep that cramped 2-bedroom apartment that she shared with her sister and nephew. But Margaret Johnson had something that Thomas Murphy couldn't stand. Pride. She walked with her head high through Harlem's streets. She spoke proper English when she needed to. She demanded respect from store clerks and didn't step off sidewalks when white folks approached. In Murphy's eyes, she was getting too comfortable, too uppity for a colored woman living in his building. The first warning came disguised as a rent increase, 300% overnight. This is illegal, Margaret told the building superintendent, a nervous man named Pete who couldn't look her in the eyes. Talk to Mr. Murphy, Pete muttered, shuffling away. When Margaret marched into Murphy's office on 125th Street, she carried herself like she owned the place. Murphy looked up from his desk, his fat fingers drumming against the mahogany surface, and smiled the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Mrs. Johnson, he said, not bothering to stand. I hear you have concerns about your new rent. I have concerns about your illegal business practices, Margaret replied, her voice steady as steel. Murphy's smile widened. He pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. See, that's the thing about you people, he said, his voice dripping with venom. Always thinking you're lawyers. Always thinking you got rights. He opened the folder and spread photographs across his desk. Pictures of Margaret entering and leaving her apartment. Pictures of her at work. Pictures of her at church. What is this? Margaret's voice never wavered, but something cold settled in her stomach. Insurance, Murphy said. See, I got friends in the housing department, friends in the police department, friends who don't like troublemakers. He leaned back in his chair, studying her reaction. Now, you can pay the new rent, or you can find somewhere else to live. Your choice. Margaret Johnson stared at the photographs for a long moment. Then she gathered them up one by one and placed them back in the folder. Mr. Murphy, she said quietly, you don't know who you're messing with. Murphy laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. Lady, I've been running buildings in Harlem for 15 years. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're nobody. Your whole family is nobody. And if you don't like it, you can take it up with my friends downtown. Margaret turned toward the door, then stopped. My son is coming home next week, she said without looking back. You might want to remember that. Murphy's laughter followed her all the way to the street. What Thomas Murphy didn't know was that Margaret's son had spent the last 5 years learning lessons that weren't taught in any school. He'd learned them in the back alleys of Chicago, in the gambling halls of Detroit, and in the shadowy corners where power was bought and sold like any other commodity. Bumpy Johnson was coming home, and he was about to remind Harlem why some names should never be spoken lightly. 3 days later, Margaret found the eviction notice nailed to her door. 30 days to vacate. No appeals, no negotiations. When Bumpy stepped off the train at Penn Station that following Tuesday morning, he looked like any other young man returning home from a business trip. Clean suit, polished shoes, a newspaper tucked under his arm. But the conductor who helped him with his bags noticed something the other passengers missed. Bumpy Johnson's eyes never stopped moving. And when he smiled at the porter who carried his luggage, it was the kind of smile that made smart men very nervous. The first thing Bumpy did was visit his mother, The second thing he did was read every word of that eviction notice. The third thing he did was walk to Murphy's office, tip his hat to the secretary, and ask for 5 minutes of the man's time. "Tell Mr. Murphy that Bumpy Johnson would like to have a conversation about rent," he told the nervous woman behind the desk. What happened during that conversation, nobody knows for sure. But witnesses say that when Bumpy walked out of Murphy's office 20 minutes later, his suit was still pressed, his hat was still perfectly positioned, and he was humming a song his mother used to sing when he was small. Murphy, on the other hand, looked like he'd seen a ghost. But here's the thing about men like Thomas Murphy. They don't scare easy, and they don't stay scared long. Power corrupts, but it also makes you stupid. It makes you think that because you've been winning for so long, you'll keep winning forever. 2 days after Bumpy's visit, Margaret Johnson received another notice. This time it wasn't about rent. This time Murphy was claiming that she'd been running an illegal boarding house, disturbing the peace and violating health codes. The eviction date was moved up. She had 1 week. That's when Bumpy Johnson stopped being polite. But what Murphy didn't realize was that Bumpy wasn't just angry. He wasn't just planning revenge. He was orchestrating something much more dangerous than that. Bumpy Johnson was orchestrating a lesson. And in Harlem, lessons taught by Bumpy Johnson were never forgotten. The next morning, Murphy received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, and terrifying in its certainty. "Mr. Murphy, this is Detective Frank Morrison, Housing Violations Unit. We need to discuss some serious allegations about your properties." Murphy's blood went cold. Morrison was one of his guys. One of the cops he'd been paying for years to look the other way. "Frank, what the hell are you talking about? We had an understanding." "Understandings change, Tom. Word came down from the top. Internal Affairs is sniffing around. They got pictures, recordings, documentation going back 3 years. I can't protect you anymore." The line went dead. Murphy sat in his office, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill. This wasn't possible. He owned half the housing department. He had judges in his pocket. City inspectors ate Christmas dinner at his house. But as the day progressed, Murphy's world began to crumble piece by piece. First, it was the health inspector who showed up unannounced at his Lenox Avenue building. Then it was the fire marshal at his property on Amsterdam. By noon, he'd received violation notices for buildings he'd been running dirty for years. Buildings that had never been inspected. Buildings that should have been condemned. "How?" Murphy screamed at his secretary. "How did they find out about the basement apartments? How did they know about the illegal subdivisions?" The secretary, a thin woman named Helen who'd worked for Murphy for 8 years, just shrugged. "Maybe somebody talked," she said quietly. What Murphy didn't know was that somebody had been talking, lots of somebodies, and they'd all been talking to the same person. Bumpy Johnson had spent his first week back in Harlem doing something that Murphy never expected. He'd been listening to the stories of every tenant in every building Murphy owned. Stories of broken pipes that never got fixed. Stories of families cramming into spaces meant for one person because Murphy charged them double for the privilege. Stories of young women who paid their rent in ways that had nothing to do with money. But Bumpy didn't just listen. He documented. Names, dates, photographs, witnesses. He built a case that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. The second phone call came at 2 p.m. "Murphy Real Estate, this is Tom." "Mr. Murphy, this is Sarah Goldman from the New York Housing Authority. I'm calling regarding your certification status for low-income housing programs." Murphy's hand tightened on the receiver. The Housing Authority contracts were his bread and butter. 30 buildings, all subsidized by the city, all paying him guaranteed rent regardless of who lived there. "What about my certification?" "I'm afraid we're going to need to conduct a full audit, effective immediately. We have received reports of significant violations of federal housing standards. Your contracts are suspended pending investigation." Murphy's face went white. Without the Housing Authority contracts, he'd lose half his income overnight. "Who filed the reports?" "I'm not at liberty to say. But Mr. Murphy, the documentation is very thorough, very professional. Whoever filed these complaints knew exactly what they were doing." As Murphy hung up, his hands were shaking. This wasn't random, this wasn't coincidence. Someone was systematically destroying his business, and they were using his own corruption against him. But Murphy had survived in Harlem for 15 years by being meaner and more vicious than anyone who challenged him. If someone wanted to play dirty, he could play dirty too. That evening, Murphy made 3 phone calls. The first was to Lieutenant Michael O'Brien, a cop who owed Murphy more favors than he could count. The second was to Vincent Torino, a man who specialized in making problems disappear. The third was to Judge Harrison Blackwood, who'd been on Murphy's payroll since 1935. "I need this Johnson family dealt with," Murphy told each of them. "The mother, the son, anyone who's been helping them. I don't care what it costs." Within hours, Margaret Johnson found herself arrested for disturbing the peace. The charge was bogus, the arrest was illegal, but Judge Blackwood signed the warrant anyway. She was thrown into the Tombs, New York's notorious city jail, to await a hearing that might never come. When word reached Bumpy, he was sitting in Small's Paradise, a jazz club on 135th Street, nursing a glass of bourbon and listening to a trumpet player work magic with a Duke Ellington number. The messenger was a kid named Tommy who worked the streets for tips and information. "Mr. Bumpy," Tommy whispered, sliding into the booth. "They got your mama. Locked her up downtown. Word is Murphy made some calls." Bumpy's expression never changed. He finished his bourbon, placed a $5 bill on the table, and stood up slowly. "Tommy," he said quietly, "I want you to deliver a message for me." The boy nodded eagerly. "Tell Murphy that I'll be seeing him tomorrow morning. Tell him to have his affairs in order." Tommy started to leave, then turned back. "Mr. Bumpy, what if he asks what you mean by affairs?" Bumpy Johnson smiled, and for the first time since coming home to Harlem, it wasn't a pleasant smile. "Tell him he'll understand soon enough." But Murphy had made a critical error in judgment. He thought that by having Margaret arrested, he'd shown Bumpy who had the real power in this game. He thought he'd proven that connections and corruption would always beat street smarts and determination. What Murphy didn't realize was that while he'd been playing checkers, Bumpy Johnson had been playing chess, and Bumpy's next move wasn't just going to free his mother. It was going to destroy everything Murphy had built piece by piece and leave him begging for mercy that would never come. The game was about to change. But Murphy didn't know that yet. He was about to find out that when you mess with family in Bumpy Johnson's world, you don't just make an enemy, you wake up a monster. The next morning, while Margaret Johnson sat in a cold cell downtown, Bumpy Johnson was having breakfast at Sylvia's on Lenox Avenue. He ordered the same thing he'd eaten as a child: grits, scrambled eggs, and thick-cut bacon. But this wasn't nostalgia. This was strategy. Every morning for 5 years in Chicago, Bumpy had studied how real power worked. Not the kind that came from muscle or fear. The kind that came from information, patience, and understanding that every man had a weakness. Every system had a crack. Thomas Murphy's crack was his greed. "Morning, Mr. Johnson," said Sylvia herself, sliding into the booth across from him. "Heard about your mama. I'm sorry." Bumpy nodded, cutting his eggs with surgical precision. "Sylvia, I need to ask you something. How many of Murphy's tenants eat here?" Sylvia's eyes narrowed. She'd been running this restaurant for 12 years, and she knew the difference between a question and a request. "Most of them." "Why?" "Because I'm about to give them something more valuable than a good meal." What Bumpy had learned in Chicago was that corruption was like a spider web. Pull one thread and everything connected started to shake. Murphy didn't just own buildings. He owned people. Judges, cops, inspectors, politicians. All of them taking money, all of them compromised, all of them vulnerable. But Bumpy had something Murphy didn't expect. He had Ruth. Ruth Morrison was Detective Frank Morrison's wife. She was also Margaret Johnson's best friend, and she'd been listening to her husband's phone conversations for 3 months, ever since she found out about the money he'd been taking from Murphy. Ruth had been recording everything, collecting evidence, waiting for the right moment to destroy the man who'd turned her husband into a criminal. That moment had arrived. "Mrs. Morrison," Bumpy said, sitting in her kitchen that afternoon while Detective Morrison was at work. "I think it's time we had a conversation about justice." Ruth Morrison was a small woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. She poured Bumpy coffee from a pot that had been brewing too long and sat down across from him. "My husband thinks he's smart," she said quietly. "But he keeps his dirty money in a shoebox under our bed. He writes everything down in a little notebook. Names, dates, amounts. $23,000 over 2 years. Bumpy sipped his coffee. It was terrible, but he didn't flinch. "That's good information, Mrs. Morrison, but I need more than good information. I need proof that will hold up in federal court." Ruth Morrison smiled for the first time in months. "Mr. Johnson, you're looking at a woman who spent 15 years working for the FBI before I married Frank. I know exactly what kind of proof you need." What happened next took place over 72 hours, but it felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Ruth Morrison had been more than just an FBI employee. She'd been a specialist in financial crimes, and she still had friends in Washington who owed her favors. Big favors. While Murphy was making phone calls trying to figure out who was destroying his business, Ruth was making different kinds of phone calls. To Agent Patricia Williams at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. To Prosecutor David Chen at the Southern District of New York. To IRS investigator Michael Rodriguez, who specialized in tax evasion cases. "Patricia," Ruth said during her first call, "remember that favor you said you owed me? I'm ready to collect." By Tuesday morning, Murphy's world had become a nightmare. Federal agents were camped outside his office. IRS investigators were auditing his books going back 7 years. The FBI had frozen his bank accounts pending investigation into racketeering charges. But Murphy still had one card to play. He still had Margaret Johnson in jail, and he still had friends who could make her disappear permanently. That's when Bumpy made his move. Wednesday afternoon, Murphy received a visitor he wasn't expecting. Judge Harrison Blackwood walked into his office looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "Tom, we need to talk." Murphy looked up from his desk, where federal subpoenas were scattered like fallen leaves. "Harry, thank God you're here. We need to get that Johnson woman transferred. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere accidents happen." Judge Blackwood sat down heavily in the leather chair across from Murphy's desk. "Tom, I can't help you anymore." "What do you mean you can't help me? I've been paying you for 3 years." "That's the problem," Blackwood said quietly. "They have the payments, all of them. Bank records, cash deposits, everything. Internal Affairs showed me photographs this morning. Me taking envelopes from you. Me signing warrants I never read. Me fixing cases for money." Murphy's face went white. How? How could they possibly have that? Judge Blackwood pulled out a small recording device and placed it on Murphy's desk. "Because I've been wearing this for the last 6 months. Federal prosecutors offered me a deal. 20 years in prison, or cooperation. I chose cooperation." Murphy stared at the device like it was a poisonous snake. "Harry, you can't do this to me. We're partners. Tom, you made me a criminal. You corrupted me. You used me. And you destroyed my career. But you know what the worst part is?" Murphy shook his head, unable to speak. "The worst part is that you were so arrogant, so convinced you were untouchable, that you never once considered that someone might be smarter than you. Someone might be playing a longer game." Judge Blackwood stood up, straightening his tie. "Margaret Johnson was released 20 minutes ago. All charges dropped. The warrant you had me sign? It's been ruled illegal evidence obtained through corruption." Murphy's hands were shaking now. Who's behind this?" Judge Blackwood smiled sadly. "Tom, you still don't understand. This isn't about who. This is about consequences. You spent 15 years thinking that money and fear were the only kinds of power that mattered. You forgot about intelligence. You forgot about patience." As Judge Blackwood reached the door, he turned back one last time. "You forgot about family." Murphy sat alone in his office as the afternoon shadows grew longer. Federal agents were seizing his files. His bank accounts were frozen. His police contacts had vanished. His political connections had disappeared. And somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was walking his mother home from jail. But Murphy didn't know that this was just the beginning. He didn't know that Bumpy Johnson had been playing a game so sophisticated, so completely planned, that everything Murphy thought he understood about power was about to be turned upside down. The real lesson was about to begin. Thomas Murphy thought he was a king. On Thursday morning, sitting in what remained of his crumbling empire, he still believed he could win. The feds were circling, his corrupt network was collapsing, but Murphy had one final card to play. One last desperate move that would either save him or destroy him completely. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd hoped never to use. Torino, it's Murphy. I need the special service. Tonight. Vincent Torino was the kind of man who made problems disappear permanently. For the right price, accidents happened. People vanished. Witnesses forgot what they'd seen. You sure about this, Murphy? Things are pretty hot right now with all these feds sniffing around. I'm sure. The Johnson family. All of them. Make it look like an accident. What Murphy didn't know was that his phone had been tapped for 3 days. Every conversation, every desperate call, every criminal conspiracy was being recorded by the same federal agents who were building an airtight case against him. But more importantly, Murphy didn't know that Bumpy Johnson had been expecting this move. That evening, as Murphy sat in his office waiting for confirmation that his problems had been eliminated, the door opened. But it wasn't Torino walking in. It was Bumpy Johnson himself, carrying a briefcase and wearing the same calm smile he'd worn the first time they'd met. Evening, Mr. Murphy. Murphy's hand moved toward the gun in his desk drawer. Don't, Bumpy said quietly. You're going to want to hear what I have to say first. Johnson, you have no idea who you're messing with. I've got connections you can't imagine. Power you'll never understand. Bumpy set the briefcase on Murphy's desk and opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, documents, recordings, and evidence that made Murphy's blood turn to ice. You mean connections like Detective Morrison? Bumpy pulled out a photograph of Murphy handing cash to the corrupt cop. He's been wearing a wire for 6 months. Every conversation you've had with him is on federal tape. Murphy's face went white, but Bumpy wasn't finished. Or maybe you mean power like Judge Blackwood? Another photograph. Murphy and the judge in a restaurant, money changing hands across the table. He cut a deal with Internal Affairs 3 weeks ago. Every warrant he signed for you was illegal. Murphy's hands were shaking now. Or perhaps you're talking about your friend Torino. Bumpy smiled, and this time it was the kind of smile that promised terrible things. Vincent's been very cooperative with federal investigators, especially after they showed him the 20-year prison sentence he was facing for racketeering. Murphy stared at the evidence spread across his desk. Bank records showing payoffs, photographs documenting corruption, audio recordings of criminal conspiracies. It was enough to put him away for life. How? Murphy whispered. How did you get all this? Bumpy closed the briefcase and sat down across from Murphy's desk. Mr. Murphy, you made a fundamental error in judgment. You thought corruption was strength. You thought fear was power. You thought money could buy loyalty. Murphy was sweating now, despite the October chill. But you know what real power is? Bumpy continued. Real power is understanding that every man has a choice. You can choose to be a criminal, or you can choose to be a good man who made bad decisions and wants to make them right. Murphy's voice cracked. What do you want? I want justice, not revenge. Justice. Bumpy reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is a confession. Every crime you've committed, every person you've corrupted, every family you've destroyed. You're going to sign it. Murphy looked at the document. It was comprehensive, detailed, and devastating. Signing it would mean admitting to crimes that would put him in prison for the rest of his life. And if I don't sign? Bumpy's expression never changed. Then tomorrow morning, the New York Times runs a front-page story about corruption in Harlem real estate. The FBI releases those recordings of you ordering hits on American citizens. The IRS publishes your tax records showing unreported income from criminal enterprises. Murphy stared at the confession, his hands trembling. But if I sign this, at least you get to surrender with dignity. You get to walk into federal court like a man instead of being dragged out of here in handcuffs. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Murphy picked up his pen. "You know," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I always thought I was the smartest man in Harlem." "Mr. Murphy," Bumpy replied, "you weren't even the smartest man in this room." As Murphy signed his name to the confession sealing his fate, the door opened again. This time it was Margaret Johnson, accompanied by FBI agent Patricia Williams and 2 federal marshals. Murphy looked up, confused. "Mrs. Johnson," Agent Williams said formally, "would you please identify this man as the person who attempted to have you illegally evicted and subsequently arrested on false charges?" Margaret Johnson looked at Thomas Murphy for a long moment. The man who had terrorized her, humiliated her, and tried to destroy her family now sat broken and defeated, signing away his freedom with shaking hands. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's him." Agent Williams nodded to the marshals. "Thomas Murphy, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, tax evasion, bribery of public officials, and violation of federal housing laws." As the handcuffs clicked around Murphy's wrists, he looked at Bumpy one final time. "This isn't over," he said desperately. "You can't destroy me. I'm untouchable." Bumpy Johnson stood up, straightened his tie, and walked to the door. "Mr. Murphy," he said without looking back, "nobody's untouchable. You just forgot that lesson until it was too late." The game was over. Justice had been served. But what Murphy still didn't understand was that this wasn't just about one corrupt landlord and one evicted family. This was about something much bigger, something that would change Harlem forever. If you think Thomas Murphy got exactly what he deserved, hit that like button. Because this story is about to get even more legendary. 6 months later, Thomas Murphy sat in a federal penitentiary cell, staring at gray concrete walls and wondering how his empire had crumbled so completely. The man who once owned half of Harlem now owned nothing but regret and a 25-year prison sentence. But Murphy's downfall was just the beginning of something much bigger. The corruption network that Bumpy Johnson had exposed didn't stop with one racist landlord. The federal investigation that started with Margaret Johnson's eviction notice eventually led to the arrests of 12 police officers, 4 judges, 6 city inspectors, and 2 housing authority officials. The entire system that had allowed men like Murphy to terrorize Harlem families for decades came crashing down. Detective Frank Morrison received a 15-year sentence for accepting bribes and falsifying evidence. Judge Harrison Blackwood lost his position and served 8 years for judicial corruption. Vincent Torino, the enforcer who was supposed to eliminate the Johnson family, became a federal witness and disappeared into the witness protection program. But the real legacy of that October night wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. Word spread through Harlem's streets like wildfire. The story of how Bumpy Johnson had taken down Thomas Murphy without firing a single shot. How he'd used intelligence instead of violence. How he'd turned the corrupt system against itself and won justice for his family. Young men who might have chosen the gun chose strategy instead. Families who had been intimidated by corrupt landlords started fighting back with documentation and evidence. The community learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a bullet. It was knowing how the game was really played. Margaret Johnson moved into a beautiful brownstone on Strivers Row, one of Harlem's most prestigious addresses. She never paid rent to another corrupt landlord. She never had to worry about eviction notices or midnight visits from dirty cops. She lived with dignity until the day she died, 23 years later, surrounded by children and grandchildren who all knew the story of how their family had stood up to injustice and won. But the most important change was in Bumpy himself. The young man who had returned from Chicago angry and ready for war had learned something crucial during those 3 weeks in October. Real power wasn't about fear or violence. Real power was about understanding systems, building alliances, and using intelligence to create justice where none existed before. Bumpy Johnson became a legend in Harlem, but not for the reasons people expected. He became known as the man who could solve problems without bloodshed. The man who understood that sometimes the most devastating weapon you could use against an enemy was their own corruption. Years later, when federal investigators would ask how he'd managed to coordinate such a complex takedown of Murphy's criminal network, Bumpy would smile that same calm smile and give them the same answer he'd given Murphy that night in the office. "Justice doesn't require violence," he would say. "It just requires patience, intelligence, and understanding that every man makes choices. I just helped them make better ones." The story of Bumpy Johnson and Thomas Murphy became required reading in law enforcement academies. Federal agents studied it as an example of how organized crime networks could be dismantled through intelligence gathering rather than brute force. Social workers used it to teach communities how to fight back against systemic corruption. But in Harlem, the story meant something different. It meant that no matter how powerful your enemies seemed, no matter how corrupt the system appeared, there was always a way to win if you were smart enough, patient enough, and determined enough to see it through. Margaret Johnson kept the original eviction notice framed on her mantelpiece until the day she died, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as proof that sometimes the worst moments in life are just the beginning of something extraordinary. Thomas Murphy died in prison in 1955, 17 years into his sentence. He never saw Harlem again. He never owned another building. His real estate empire was sold off to pay legal fees and federal fines, and his name became synonymous with the kind of corruption that destroyed communities. But Murphy's greatest punishment wasn't prison. It was knowing that he'd been outsmarted by a family he thought was powerless. That he'd been defeated not by violence or intimidation, but by intelligence and strategy. That he'd spent 15 years thinking he was untouchable, only to discover that nobody ever is. The lesson of October 1938 echoed through Harlem for generations. Respect isn't something you can buy with money or enforce with fear. Respect is something you earn through character, intelligence, and understanding that true strength comes from lifting up your community, not tearing it down. And sometimes, just sometimes, when good people decide they've had enough and fight back with wisdom instead of weapons, justice isn't just served, it's legendary. If this story of intelligence defeating corruption inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more legendary tales of justice, because in the streets of Harlem, respect wasn't given freely. It was earned one brilliant move at a time. The game was over. Bumpy Johnson had won, and Harlem would never be the